Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pixels and Profits, episode number 3. Today, we are joined by the famous Serkan Toto from games industry consultancy Kantan Games, based in Tokyo. And Serkan is quite possibly the foremost expert on the Japanese video games industry. Welcome, Serkan.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. And besides Serkan, again with us today, you have the Pixel Brothers, myself, Joseph Kim, Matthew Contraman, and Brian Peganoff. Welcome back, guys.
Thanks, Joe.
I'm very excited today as we will be discussing the top 3 Japanese and top 3 Korean video game companies, which means from Japan, Nintendo, Sony, and Square Enix, and from Korea, Nexon, Netmarble, and NCSoft. Although I think Matthew will kind of go into Nexon's kind of a Japanese company, kind of a Korean company. We can go into the details on that. But before diving in to discuss these specific companies, the top 3 Japanese and Korean game companies, I wanted to actually take a step back and also just kind of get a sense of the overall market in terms of when it comes to Japan and Korea, are there specific trends? Are there specific insights or key things that we should be aware of when it comes to these companies? Serkan, maybe we can hand it over to you to get your kind of overall high level take. Today's episode is sponsored by Data.ai. To access estimates for rankings, downloads, revenue, usage, or engagement for millions of apps on the App Store and Google Play, sign up for Data.ai.
So there's a couple. So I think that for the as far as console games are concerned, I think that China is still a very small market. I think that Korea is a very small market for console games. So if you look at the Chinese market, it's all about mobile and PC. Very very similar to Korea, whereas in Japan, mobile is absolute king. And console is a distant second. So mobile in Japan is around a $10 billion business. Depends on the data provider that you ask. Depends on the currency rate conversion rate, and other factors. But roughly, it's in that ballpark, and it has been that way for like about a decade. Right. So, but the console market in Japan has always been relatively stable if you just look at the numbers. And the reason why I'm saying that is that sometimes, people think that, the Japanese console gaming space is dead. A couple of years ago, there was basically like one big trend that people saw in the global console gaming market, because the US was taking over back at that time in terms of revenue and things like that. But actually, that never happened. So the domestic console gaming market in Japan is still quite big. I think that as far as video games in the big Asian regions go, this is, I think, one big trend that you have these kind of like different splits across these countries.
And I think when it comes to Asia, it also seems like would it be fair to say that there is kind of like a crypto trend amongst at least some of the Korean companies?
Absolutely, yeah, that's a big one. That's a very, very big one. So, so in the West at the moment, at the point at the point of time of recording this, in June 2023, crypto is declared largely dead in terms of crypto gaming in the West, right? Largely, not absolutely, but largely. Whereas in Asia, that discussion actually never happened, right? So never happened, at least to that extent. So if you look at the list of publicly traded Japanese video game and mobile game companies, by the way, almost everybody on that list, or almost every company on that list, to some degree, is active in crypto, right? And I think that you will see a whole barrage of crypto games made by publicly traded Japanese companies in a couple of months. So maybe in the rest of across the rest of 2023, and at the beginning of 2024. Whereas in Korea, I have the perception that the Koreans are absolutely crypto crazy, right? Not only in gaming, but also the general population, right? Where the adoption rate is just super high. People are trading, and even after the various scandals that we had in this industry. And you just named a couple of Korean names. And there's even more than these gaming companies from Korea that are active in crypto. So basically, crypto is a big topic in the Asian gaming space. Totally different from Europe and North America.
Got it. In our last episode, we did discuss sort of the console wars, Microsoft, Nintendo, Sony. There were a number of conclusions that we came up with. I don't know if you had a chance to check it out, but like some of the conclusions, one, Microsoft may be in danger. Microsoft, meaning the Xbox part of the Microsoft business, maybe. I don't know if you would agree with us, but maybe this is one of the last generations of Xbox. I think we also came to the conclusion that mobile is not likely a big. There isn't like much synergy between mobile and to a console maker. And then
Mm,
we had a number of other conclusions, whether around the impact of live services and the free to play business model to the console market. But wondering,
right.
if you had a chance to give us feedback on that. If you disagree with anything with any of the conclusions that we've had, it'd be great to get your take. Or if you have any other insights or thoughts on just the console wars before we kind of dive into specific Japanese and Korean companies.
Right, right. Yeah, so I think that Brian hinted at that at the towards the end of the show, but I think
Mhm.
it bears repeating. And I think that I, for example, should make it actually more clear, at least in my view, that it's crystal clear that Sony has absolutely been destroying Microsoft, right, over the last generations, right. So if you look at the Xbox 360 and PS3 generation, that ended with a draw, 60 million to 60 million in terms of hardware sales, right. And I know it's not everything about hardware, but it's a significant factor in these
Right.
quote unquote console wars, right. But if you look at the last generation, the PS4 generation, Sony sold over 120 million, 125 million units. And Microsoft stopped reporting Xbox sales, hardware sales in 2015, right? And I think that since then they never even hinted at how many pieces of hardware they actually sold in a given fiscal year or in a given quarter, right? And it looks like, based on estimates that are floating around in the industry, that this generation, that ratio, that it seems to be two to one, 2.5 to 1, or something like that. It seems to be that Sony is successful in retaining that ratio. And if you look at if you compare it to sports, for example, right? I mean, if it's compared to basketball, Sony has not been beating Microsoft 100 to 90 points or 100 to 80 points. That's more like 100 to 70 points, 100 to
Mhm.
65 points. Again, I think they have been really, really, absolutely destroying them, right? And if you look at the current state of Xbox at the moment, they just launched a terrible, like, a first party game. I really don't know how that game passed QA in Microsoft's launch process in that whole greenlighting process. But they are not in a very, very good state at this point in time. I may be exaggerating, but also it looks like the Activision deal is not really looking that likely right now. It doesn't look too good for Microsoft, I would say.
Right.
I would also just jump in. One of the things that I noticed in relation to like the console markets when I was looking at the Asian companies in particular, when mobile really started to come about, there was this whole concern, which I think is now completely overblown, and we have the data to prove that mobile was going to kill console. And I think even and PC, and I think even Asia, more so than the West, has
Mm,
shown that that's not the case, and they're actually both much larger markets today,
mm,
particularly on the software side, than they were when mobile came about. Yes, you have the whales on PC, the whales on console that are staying there, and you've opened up this whole TAM on mobile with all the smartphone users. China is the best case for this, but even Korea has shown it, right? That mobile hasn't been cannibalistic. And I think we've in the last few years, starting maybe 2018, 2019, really started to see more of a push to say, hey, we can release AAA quality games on mobile and not cannibalize our core PC business. Korea, in China and Japan, console versus mobile.
Yeah, and very quickly about the mobile business of video game companies, because this is, I think, what the podcast is about. The video game companies in particular. If you look at the U.S. and if you look at Europe, mainly Ubisoft from that area, the Japanese companies and the Korean companies that used to do PC games before have absolutely been killing it on mobile, absolutely killing it on mobile. Right? So if you look at Square Enix, for example, Konami, Sega to some extent, they're not that successful, but they're still trying. And Nintendo and Capcom are the only ones that are not really super serious on mobile. All the other Japanese big video game companies that we have a pretty active mobile business. And I would say if you look at just the video game companies, not the mobile first companies, just the traditional video game companies that we all know from the 1980s, etc., Square Enix and Konami are probably the two most successful ones, commercially speaking. Mostly in Japan, but they've been very, very clever in revitalizing some of their old console IP on mobile, and largely because they are RPG based and adventure based, and they're developing games that are suitable for mobile, or that have been considered suitable for mobile for a long time. But again, they made billions. Some of these companies made billions over the last decades, just on mobile and just in Japan.
All right. Well,
Before we get into company discussions, I did have like one question, high level, about Japanese companies in particular. I think we've seen it with some of the Korean companies also, is mobile live services, because a lot of these companies have been really successful at launching these games and they make a lot of money at launch, but not all of them are so successful at maintaining the live services tail. I'm just, Square Enix has done it very well, right? We've seen that with like the Final Fantasy games and a few of the other IPs, but I think some of the games from like Nexon come out huge out of the gate, and then they just have no tail to them, right? And so I'm curious, what you've seen. Do you think the companies in Japan and Korea are getting better at this? How do you think about their live services expertise and their ability to not just have big hits, but have sustainable franchises on mobile?
Oh, I would say that on mobile in particular, the Japanese companies, there's no discussion about this, right? They invented live servicing, right? They invented this concept of having like these so-called like forever games, as I think Zynga Zynga has coined this term in the first place, right? Mobile games as we know them today, with free to play and live servicing, etc., have been around in Japan since um, spring 2007, when a company called Gree introduced what they are saying is the first mobile social game that has ever been created and ever been launched to the public, right? And Gree is a publicly traded company, right? So so the concept of live servicing has been around for a long, long time. And I would agree. There are some games that are coming out very, very strong, especially in Korea. And then you have a lot of traffic going into that given game, and then you have a certain level of monetization. The app goes up in the grossing rankings. Everybody thinks this is the next big thing, and then it drops off. But I think it's very, very different from a country like Japan, for example, where people are a lot more loyal to a given game, right? So you have games like Puzzle and Dragons, which I think is the most iconic mobile game from Japan. The game is in operation since February 2012, right? And Mixie's Monster Strike, which has been making almost $1 billion every year since launch, they launched in 2013, right? The game is still around. Last year, Monster Strike was the top grossing mobile game in Japan, but I think they made, again, the currency rate is a little bit iffy these days. Between the Japanese yen and the US, they made 700 million, right? In just in Japan, just with that one mobile game. So they make, what is it, almost $2 million per day, and that's just pure live servicing, right? I mean, it's a live servicing business, right? That particular company, Mixi, that has developed the Monster Strike, is a live servicing business. Gung Ho is a live servicing business. Square Enix has been live servicing a couple of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest based mobile games for years and years and years now.
Okay. Well, let's dive into these companies. I'm excited to get your takes on this. And so maybe starting with Japan and Nintendo, I'll hand it over to you, Brian, to give us a little overview on Nintendo.
Sounds good. Yeah, so Nintendo is a publicly traded company, market cap about $57 billion. The stock is up about 5% year to date versus 39% for the Qs and 16% for SPY. So it's certainly a meaningful underperformer. In its last investor release in mid-May, the company reported 12.2 billion in fiscal 22 and guided 23 to 11.5 billion, so a 5.5% year-on-year contraction. They did about 4.2 billion of OI in 22, guiding 23 to 3.63 billion. So the stock is trading at about 5x forward revenues and 16x forward OI. Also worth noting, like consensus numbers for this stock are very similar to what the company has guided to. And I think Matt alluded to last time, Nintendo has a storied tradition of sandbagging guidance. So that kind of remains to be seen what the actual print does. And I would also note, since that last investor release in mid-May, the stock is up only 3% versus S&P about 6-ish. So again, still materially underperforming. So I guess I wanted to kind of launch into why I like Nintendo here for a variety of reasons. Then we'll kick it over to Serkan to get his response and maybe some other thoughts and things like that. First one, a Switch is now 6 years old. So it's reasonable to assume that a new hardware generation is kind of on the horizon. And successful hardware transitions have always been a boon for Nintendo shares in prior cycles, at least the successful ones. I also think Nintendo is a scarce asset. It's very rare to find a company that owns their own distribution ecosystem, along with a rich catalog of wholly owned IP. And the entire company is nearly wholly dedicated and exposed to gaming. The Switch generation also spurred much stronger relationships with third-party developers. I expect this to carry forward to the next generation. And I think the next generation also has like this interesting caveat of being able to test that Sony and Microsoft duopoly, given sufficient power and things like that. I do believe they've found their niche in the gaming market, which is a mix of good enough console strength alongside portability. And I think it's unlikely that that will be supplanted by competitors in the market like PlayStation or Valve without the breadth and depth of content that I think only Nintendo can deliver. Also, 43% of sales are US based. It's culturally relevant, time tested IP in the West, especially relative to the peers that we're discussing today. And lastly, it's a name where that's pretty rare in TMT, where street estimates need to move up materially. And there's a lot of chasing numbers right now in the sell side, especially with mega caps. So end of summer is typically the time when investors start focusing on next year's estimates. So the reasons that you could be wrong on this is I think there's some hope of a new hardware generation baked into the stock right now, especially after a guide down, and that could take a little longer to materialize or announce than expected. Nintendo's vision for the next generation could certainly miss the mark. They've done it before, but I think that's pretty unlikely. And then the last one is that software units and sales could underwhelm. And for reference there, they guided to 100 million 80 units this year versus 214 million last year. So that's down 16%. I guess I'll kick it off with my first question for Serkan. What are your thoughts on next generation hardware? Do you think Nintendo will continue down their current path with a stronger portable console or go a completely different direction?
Yeah, so the so-called like Switch 2, as people put it, it has been like this unicorn, in the video game industry that nobody has actually seen, nobody has actually touched, but everybody's talking about it, and there seems to be something in the air, but nobody knows what it's going to be, right? And I myself have been burned like publicly already with speculation around the Switch 2. I think at least 2 times when I thought that it's really coming this time, and apparently a next generation hardware was out there, as in the form of a development kit at some point in time. But then, Nintendo apparently killed it, and it never happened. So I think there is not going to be an updated version of the Switch, but a next generation hardware as the next big launch for Nintendo. That's point one. The second point is, nobody knows what kind of hardware Nintendo is going to put out next time, especially on the TV console side. Because I think that until 2017, Nintendo basically has been running 2 separate businesses, right? The TV console business and the handheld console business. I think that's very, very important from my view to understand about the company as a whole. Now, since 2017, they only have one platform, right? And that might be good and might be bad, depending on how successful that particular platform is. But that's the situation right now. And until then, that again, two different businesses with different addressable markets, different pricing, different hardware, different software development teams, really almost completely separate, right? And I think that the challenge now for Nintendo is now to ask themselves, or for investors also, what are they going to do next? Are they going to are they going to have a more conservative Switch 2 that is just a beefed up Switch with maybe the one or the other bell and whistle added to the platform? Or are they going to have a completely new form factor, completely new concept, a completely new way to delight users and make them smile, as Nintendo would put it, right? And I personally think that at least on paper, and I'm already hedging, because it's Nintendo, right? Because they now have only one business that they focus on, their appetite for launching weird experiments like the Wii U, the Wii back in the day, for example, right, which was a total departure from the GameCube, is probably limited this time. Because if they screw up this time, they have to carry that piece of hardware that they screwed up with for through the next 4 or 5 years, right? Because you cannot launch a totally new piece of hardware every 1 or 2 years. That's not possible. Not even for Nintendo, right? So that's point one. The second point is, I think that it will have whatever the next hardware is going to be. It will have a portable element because of a very, very simple reason, and that reason is Pokemon, right? So Pokemon is traditionally the first game came out, I think, in 1996, right? And since then, it has been basically synonymous with portable Nintendo hardware. I know that now the latest versions, you can play on the Switch. There has been some spin-offs that you could actually already play on TV consoles before the Switch. I know that, but it's basically like a handheld game, right? I mean, the portability factor is a big one for the Pokemon brand. And Nintendo will never abandon Pokemon. By extension, Nintendo will never abandon the portable gaming business. That's why I think the portable element will play a major role in whatever the next Switch hardware, Nintendo hardware is going to be.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And, to your point, they only have one platform now. They need to avoid on average, they're due for a flop, right? Just that's the history of Nintendo. But they need to avoid that this time around. So it does make sense for them to be more conservative. I think it was Sharp also that kind of indicated that they received orders for a customer's next generation entertainment product. So, that makes you think they're sticking to something familiar if they're using the existing screen supplier, display supplier already. So, it makes total sense for them to be conservative and stick with what they're good at. I just really want them to remaster Pokemon Red and Blue. Like, that would probably sell 40 million units easy. Yeah. Easy. Like, I don't understand why it hasn't been done yet.
Because it's Nintendo, right? And you talked about I think Brian mentioned like investors and Nintendo, and I consult to a lot of financial institutions like in my everyday work, and it is always like over 10 years now. There's always been like a love-hate relationship. Right, so some investors come from the US to Tokyo. They meet me, and then we talk about Nintendo. They go to Kyoto to talk with the company, come back and tell me that they want to short the stock, right? Because they're so bad at selling themselves, right? So just like so living in their own like Nintendo world, far away in Kyoto, which is like not a metropolis like a metropolis like Tokyo, for example, right? And it's just a very, very strange company sometimes, especially in their communications to shareholders. So it's for a lot of shareholders, it's Nintendo's after all of these years is still very enigmatic.
So what do you think? What do you think about just sentiment now, especially with a hit movie behind them, and also that Zelda title you just finished playing last night?
I think, I did. So I think that around 10 years, investors hated the stock. Everybody hated Nintendo stock, right? And at some point in time, the stock was below 10,000. Now there was a stock split in between, right? 10-1 stock split. So if you look at the stock now, it's I think 6,000 yen or something like that. But back then it was it would have been like 60,000, right, before the stock split. And again, I think in 2014, the stock was at 9,900 or something like that. 1 year later, Gung Ho, the company behind Puzzle and Dragons that I just mentioned, the market cap for a few days of Gung Ho was higher than that of Nintendo. Absolute insanity. It makes no sense, right? It made no sense 10 years ago, and now, today it's a travesty to even think about it, right? So what I'm trying to say is that the sentiment for Nintendo now is much better than it used to be during the Wii U time, or during around the launch at the Wii U, where basically everybody has written off Nintendo. And the most extreme that I heard from an investor was from the US. And basically, that person said that Nintendo is going to be the next Atari, right? I mean, that never happened, right? I mean, that's a very radical statement back then already. That never happened, but much better now. But I think that everybody agrees to a kind of like wait and see approach as far as Nintendo is concerned. Everybody's looking at the next hardware. I think that the Switch has already been written off as a success story for Nintendo, and it has instilled a confidence back into the market as far as Nintendo is concerned. But again, everybody's waiting for the fabled Switch 2.
And Serkan, you had mentioned the historical context of Nintendo kind of being the two parts, right? The portable and then the console. And now that they're focused on the one business or the one platform, you could kind of understand why in the past they may have been reluctant to push mobile, because it would compete more directly with the portable side of the business. But do you think that now, and to your point, there are a number of Japanese companies who have done tremendously well on mobile. What do you think in terms of Nintendo's mobile push in the future? Are they going to just keep things status quo, or do you think they could now that they're focused on like the one, even though it's maybe a bit of a hybrid sort of platform, do you think they would push more meaningfully into mobile?
So when Nintendo announced their entry into mobile, I was there at the press conference, right? I was sitting in
Okay.
the second row, and back then the now unfortunately deceased Nintendo president was speaking, and then Iwata-san, and then he was saying, yeah, we're going to push into mobile, and it's a new frontier for us, and our content is suitable for mobile. And the reason why was very simple, because Nintendo was in a very bad financial situation at that point, right? So if you look at Nintendo right now, it's a totally different company in a lot of ways. I mean, I can talk about that just about that for an hour. But I think that Nintendo looks down on mobile games, right? I think that Nintendo thinks that mobile games are junk food that you consume while you wait for the bus, right? And I think that Nintendo thinks that they are crafting video games. That's why they can charge $60 or $70 in the case of Tears of the Kingdom for this gourmet food that they're making, right? And I think that this is really a part of Nintendo's thinking and of their identity, right? At least at this point in time, right? So if you look at Nintendo's mobile business right now, the last real mobile game that you can call a game came out in September. I think it was September 2019, before COVID.
Is that
Right,
Super
so
Mario Run?
Super Mario Run was, yeah, well, that was the first,
Yeah.
but I think that came out in 2016. So that was, Miyamoto was on stage at the Apple event, and and things of that nature. But the Mario Kart Tour was really the last, I think, Nintendo game. And what is it now? 4 years almost, right? 3 years and 9 months. And if that kind of like time distance doesn't tell you everything about what you want to know about Nintendo's mobile ambitions at this point in time, I don't know how to help you, right? I mean, they are not interested, right? And they were asked earlier this calendar year, what's up with your mobile games? Are you looking at the space? I think it was at an investor that asked them during the Q&A at the earnings results, and they said we're working on something. And when we have something to announce, we're going to announce it. But since then, absolute dead silence from Nintendo about their mobile business. There is no mobile business. Almost
Yeah,
nothing. Almost nothing, you have to say.
I mean, you hit it. So I'm not gonna, I mean, I can just repeat it. I don't think culturally it's in their DNA to even consider mobile. I don't know if it had to do with cannibalization or not, but it just seems something that you described it perfectly. So I'm not going to go there. It's just ironic that like one of the most defining mobile games is their partner's IP is Pokemon Go, which they get royalties from, right? So, and there was that whole mess up with people not understanding the financials of that either. They had to like kind of correct the market. That what was that 2016? They had to come out and be like, yeah, we only get like modest royalties. It's not, and the stock were like, woo, and it was all fun back then.
It's so Nintendo back then. What happened back then. With investors and the communication. It's so typical, right? So, but yeah. So I think that Nintendo is not really interested in that sector. At least in that at this point in time. And it's a pity from an investor point of view, because with the launch of Fire Emblem Heroes. The mobile game based on their Fire Emblem strategy series, they proved that they can actually have a global hit on mobile. So that game, didn't make Candy Crush numbers, but I think it did okay, relatively well in terms of revenue. I think the lifetime is probably like crossed $1 billion or something like that for Nintendo. Not that bad, for like a third tier IP from Nintendo. But I think that unless the company's down at its knees again, they won't back off from this idea of like owning the entire stack. Nintendo loves being an integrated software and platform provider. They love owning that entire stack, right? And if they go to Apple or Android, they lose control of a lot of things that they are used to being in control of, and that's too much apparently for a 130-year-old proud Kyoto company.
So Hoyo versus Safe. They can keep doing their strategy of copying Nintendo titles and bringing them to mobile and cross-platform.
You mean MiHoYo? You said MiHoYo?
Yeah, well, that's kind of like the word on the street, right? The rumors is that kind of like the MiHoYo Hoyoverse, now known as Hoyoverse strategy, is let's look at Nintendo's catalog and let's just make that but mobile, free to play, cross-platform.
I mean, Genshin is Zelda,
right?
Honkai Star Rail is kind of Fire Emblem, right? Like they're just going down the list. They're gonna probably make a monster game at some point, and they're gonna call it something like Pokemon. And just take your pick. I mean, it's working. Why stop? And they're also spending $200 million on UA for every game, so that helps too.
Yeah, why would they stop, right? I mean, if it makes sense for them commercially. If Nintendo doesn't do it, somebody else will.
Yeah. All right, Brian, should we move on to Sony?
Yeah, let's do Sony. So Sony, obviously also a publicly traded company, a market cap of about $120 billion. Their gaming business is called Gaming Network Services. That did about $26 billion in revenue in fiscal 22 and about 28 as guided in 23 for 7 to 8% growth. Gaming as a part of Sony's total business is about 31 to 34% of revenues and 20 to 21% of operating income. So much like Nintendo, new console launches are a pretty big catalyst for Sony's gaming biz traditionally. Typically, sales are tempered mainly from a consumer cost benefit analysis in the early years of the cycle. The old hardware is typically deemed good enough for the software that's out there, and there's also obviously all this development lag for developers to really utilize the new hardware. In 2021, which was the first full year of sales for the PS5, sell-through was about in line. In 2022, COVID had a pretty harsh impact on the semi-supply chain, particularly in China. Adding to that, the Eastern European conflict had negative impacts on logistics and parts inventories. And as a result, PS5 sell-through fell behind PS4. Now, fast forward to this year, Sony's put a ton of effort into multi-sourcing and logistics, and PS5 is expected to overtake PS4 during this holiday season. And concurrently, Sony is expecting engagement trends for PS5 to lap PS4 early in 2024. And adding to that, Sony is suggesting that LTV on new boxes is about 30% higher, and that's driven by huge growth in add-on purchases, which would be like microtransactions, and plus 50 to 60% growth each in accessories and subscriptions. So the high-level take here is that the ecosystem is healthy and growing. And interestingly, this is also coinciding with the 3 to 4 year lag where game developers have had access to the hardware, meaning potentially more blockbuster games on the horizon for the Sony ecosystem. And I go through a quick little strategic objectives that they have outlined. The first being M&A. They're signaling more, but the most interesting one over the past few years has been Sony's response to Activision's $70 billion acquisition by Microsoft in purchasing the studio that essentially cemented Microsoft as a major player in the gaming hardware ecosystem. So the Marathon release date is probably not until 2025, but it's arguably the most important Sony launch in a decade. They've always been weak in first-party shooters with multiplayer, and there's some other things in there like Concord and Fair Games that people are getting a little excited about. Subscriptions, they're selling 3 tiers of subscriptions now. Essential is literally essential. It's online play, game trials, and cloud streaming. 30% of their installed base is now on premium or extra, with lots of room to grow. A huge expansion in content investment, which is probably the most interesting thing that's going on. 40 to 60% of new to old in 2023, which is expanding to 50-50 by 2025. And this compares to only 20 to 80 in 2019. And then a huge expansion also in live services. 55-45 live service versus single player experiences in 2023, expanding to 60-40 in 2025. And this compares to 12 and 88 in fiscal 19. So a huge shift. Clearly, they see the writing on the wall that live service is where the money is. And this is, again, opposite of the strategy we were just talking about with Nintendo. Lastly, mobile. This is also one to keep an eye on, both in smartphone ecosystems, which we've already torn apart, and Project Q coming in November. And I think that those are both kind of out there. So I guess my first question to Serkan, how much do investors care about the gaming business versus the rest of Sony? Do you see more gaming specialists versus TMT, hardware, and financial investors? And how does that differ from the rest of the names?
Yeah, for myself, when investors are contacting me about like consulting services for that related to Sony, they want to talk about the gaming business. But they do mention that it's a little bit difficult to to basically analyze the company because it has so many different businesses. I think that Matthew called them a financial company in the last episode or the episode before that, and there's some truth to that, right? I mean, I think they have a life insurance business, a banking business, and things like that, which many people outside Japan actually don't know about. But it's true that they have a lot. They have music, movies, and all of these things, right? So, but I think that the gaming business, even the gaming business, right? So, their smartphone game business that they have with Aniplex, a label that is a subsidiary or that belongs to the subsidiary of Sony, which is Sony Music. Revenue from that mobile gaming segment doesn't flow into the PlayStation segment. It flows into the music segment, right? So you have to know that when you actually want to do a precise job of gauging Sony's gaming business. So it's quite messy, but it's not the only Japanese company that is a little bit messy from that perspective. Bandai Namco has a huge toy business, a huge licensing business. Capcom is doing pachinko arcades. Sega has a casino resort business, right? $1 billion casino resort business. They're also doing pachinko, right? Konami has a sports gym, a physical sports gym chain business. They're operating that chain in Japan. It's not a gigantic business for them, but all of these, not all of them, but a lot of these, big Japanese video game businesses have all of these side hustles. Right, and that makes them difficult to analyze, especially for non-Japanese analysts. I feel like from time to time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think these it's ever gone anywhere, but there's always been calls, particularly from Western investors, for companies like Sony to break up. Like, hey, put the PlayStation, the music, the TV business, the entertainment pieces, right? Spin those off and make that a pure play entertainment juggernaut, and it just never goes anywhere. Like, it doesn't necessarily make sense that they're under one roof, but it's just I just kind of get the sense that that's normal, and you see that across all these companies. So, it hurts shareholder value to a degree because conglomerates get valued at a discount. Like, the argument is that, hey, you can unlock shareholder value by breaking it up, but I just don't think that's ever gone anywhere, in any material discussions other than people being like, spreadsheet warriors like me, like, hey, value goes up if you break it up.
Serkan, what are your thoughts on Project Q, since I know you already have a Switch?
That's my reaction.
So do you have a PlayStation 5?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. Of course, I have a PlayStation 5. Yeah, I
Yeah.
have a PlayStation 5 and I love it. And I think that I'm a big fan of Sony's strategy overall. They've done an unbelievably good job of developing like this network of first party games and first party studios over the last decade, right? I mean, it's not a coincidence that you call them blockbusters. That Sony has been pumping out basically blockbuster after blockbuster for the last couple of years, since the PS4, PS3 generation, I think late PS3 generation, that they've been basically. I hate to harp on Xbox too much, but they have been basically killing it also when compared, especially when compared to Microsoft on the first party software front. That's one reason why they are so far ahead in terms of hardware sales, right? Because no matter what you think, no matter what you say, blockbusters drive hardware sales, right? Because a lot of people are saying, well, this is not sustainable. At some point in time, the whole ecosystem is going to implode. We talked earlier about how people were thinking that smartphones and tablets are going to kill the console gaming market altogether. That never happened, right? Because people want to have these blockbuster experiences, right? And I think that Sony has been doing a very, very good job in nurturing all of these console game studios. And now the big challenge is if they're actually going to go ahead and actually going to be able to transform themselves into a mobile slash live service company, because they said 50%, 50-50 is their revenue split target for fiscal year 2025 for console games on one side and live service and mobile games on the other side. And that's a pretty ambitious target for a company like Sony at this point in time.
JK's friend Mishka's got his work cut out for him at Sony in terms
Serkan,
of mobile.
what is your take on mobile for Sony? I think we kind of came to the conclusion, as we discussed earlier, that mobile plus console makers, there may not be too much synergy there, but what's your take? Do you think, are you optimistic or pessimistic about Sony's mobile business? And how do you think they navigate that business if they're going to do it right to get greater growth?
Yeah, they seem to be very optimistic about it, because, as I mentioned, they want to get pump up the number within the next 2 or 3 fiscals, right? So they seem to be very, very confident of their progress in that area. Otherwise, they just reiterated that. I think they had a strategy meeting, a strategy briefing for investors just a couple of weeks ago, and they reiterated that, right? So they had the same graphic on the slide. And they are saying, well, we are like still keeping that target for fiscal 2025. So at the moment, Sony has been trying it, especially in Japan, to establish like a mobile game business for years and years now. Not very successfully, you have to say. So they actually established a subsidiary in Tokyo called ForwardWorks that used some of the old PlayStation IP, very, very low key. They just tried it in Japan. I think the company still exists, but the games are basically all shut down or are not really being operated anymore. Their one big hit game though is Fate Grand Order, right? And that game came out, I think, in summer 2015, and it probably has grossed 5 billion, 6 billion since launch for Sony. So if they have one of these big blockbusters once again on the smartphone front, it could help Sony with reaching that target. But I think it's going to be tough, right? And now their mobile business seems to be a lot more internationalized. They bought Savage Studios, for example, in Berlin. And apparently, they're doing a mobile shooter that's based on one of Sony's own IPs for smartphones. But I think that part of the business is going to be tough for Sony to build a mobile gaming business that is at the scale that Sony is shooting for.
Got it. And maybe I could ask you one more question. I don't know if the other guys have other questions about Sony, but one of the things that you mentioned is that they've done a really great job in terms of first party. One of the things that I have heard is that a game like God of War from Santa Monica Studio was like it would be very difficult if it wasn't Sony to have made that game, for example. And so when you think about Sony versus another owner or another sort of game developer publisher, is there anything like do you know anything in terms of their approach towards first party that might be different from like a Microsoft strategy, or how do you think about first party titles and how Sony has been more successful than other companies in terms of like being so successful there and developing all these blockbusters, to your point?
Right, right. I think that if you look at the last string of Sony's first parties big games,
Mhm.
the number of flops is very very low actually. Right. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
not saying that every game is like a 90 on Metacritic and sells tens of millions of copies. It's not like that, but they have a pretty consistent number of really well made games.
Yes.
What I heard over the years is that Sony is absolutely hands off and lets the different studios that they have in Europe, and in America. In Japan, they only have like a smaller studio that they're operating now. Let them do their thing. And apparently, one time there was an occasion where there was like a group meeting of like the studio heads, and then there was a presentation of the ideas that they were presenting to the big guy to the Sony CEO, and then they realized that apparently at that meeting that they were developing a game that was basically targeting for like the same kind of like world setting, the same kind of genre, and one of the studios had to back off, right? Because the one studio had no idea that the other studio on the other continent is basically building almost the same game, right?
Hmm.
So that is one thing, one anecdote that I heard over the years. And but there are other anecdotes, not as meaty as this one, but that point to the fact that Sony actually lets the studios do their own thing. And I'm sure there's oversight. I'm sure there's some control by Sony HQ, by Herman, who like oversees all of these PlayStation studios. But apparently, that's one factor that is driving these studios to these results.
I guess one of the major risks then, if they are increasing their investment cadence in live services, is that we have to recognize that all of the amazing blockbusters they make are very much single player experiences with beautiful worlds and amazing narratives, but they never really made that shift to multiplayer PvP type games. And you have to wonder if that discipline carries through, or if they'll be okay launching soft games or some other kind of outcome. Because it's definitely a new tack for them, right?
That is correct. Yeah, that's correct. And if you look at the current discussion that we have in the video game world, there's a whole blood trail of closed down live service games nowadays,
Yeah.
right? So it's a very different ball game, and that's one reason why they bought Bungie, right? So on paper, they bought Bungie to help Sony out understanding live servicing, and apparently Bungie has been consulting to Naughty Dog about their Last of
Interesting.
Us multiplayer game, and as a result, the launch of that game has been postponed. So it's not going to be a walk in the park for Sony on that front for sure.
The other side of that coin is like if they do spend that cadence of investment in live services games and it has a 20-25 year lag, talk 3 or 4 years from now, Sony could dominate live services games if they have a similar track record.
Yeah, yeah, but then the big question is like who's going to play these games, right?
Yeah, right.
So there's like a finite number of players. So Sony would
It's
say, well,
competitive.
that's why we are going multi-platform, right? So that's why we are doing like these launches on the PC as well, to have like a bigger addressable market for us. But again, it's going to be tough for Sony.
I mean, it's been done before, right? Rockstar has done it. They took single player franchises and made them multiplayer. I mean, Red Dead Redemption Online never hit the highs of Grand Theft Auto Online, but it's still quite successful by
Still
many
good,
metrics,
yeah,
right?
still
So
good.
like, so it's been done before, but exactly to your point, we talked about it on the last episode, is that, or maybe even a couple episodes ago, is people have indexed a lot to COVID metrics, and post COVID engagement has consolidated into a smaller subset of leading games. You could have played Call of Duty Warzone and Apex and another shooter in 2020. Now you're playing one of them, and it's no longer just, hey, you're not competing for 20 hours anymore. You're competing for 2,000 hours,
Mm.
and that's a much different ask.
All right. Should we move on to Square Enix?
Yeah, let's jump into Square Enix. I'm gonna take over from Brian on what he likes to call the fundies, the fundamentals. Square Enix market cap of about $6 billion US, according to my phone Bloomberg, because I forgot to put it in the notes. They're most well known for Final Fantasy games, also a few IPs like Dragon Quest that are much more popular domestically than in the global market. At one point, they were known also for Crystal Dynamics. That was a studio they owned. They recently divested that in a weird deal that we can possibly get into, or that's a whole nother Embracer discussion, which could happen another day. Recently they've restructured some of their teams to focus more on blockbuster HD games and also blockchain efforts. They're like all in on blockchain, at least as much all in as you can be. In the fiscal year ending March, a lot of Japanese companies are on a March fiscal year. They generated about $2.7 billion of revenue. $2 billion of that is from the gaming business. As Serkan said, they have their side hustles. Within the gaming division, about 40% comes from HD games and mobile games split, and the remainder comes from their MMO games. So that's Final Fantasy 14 and Dragon Quest X, I believe. Those are both actually very successful MMOs. And they generated about $330 million of operating income. Looking ahead, they're projected to grow sales and OI 2.7% and 42% based on consensus in the current year. The games business is expected to grow 11%, with HD game sales rising 30% because they have several big releases planned, including Final Fantasy 16. That's a mouthful. There's a lot of moving pieces. It's a big launch year for them, and it's always exciting when they enter a big launch year. A couple of questions. Firstly, on the restructuring, divesting Crystal Dynamics and the Western studios. What do you think of this new strategy that's kind of more focused for the company going forwards?
So about the Crystal Dynamics deal, right? I mean, so I haven't, I haven't really gone in and crunched the numbers for days and for hours, but the price tag, I think it was $300 million, looks ridiculous to me, absolutely ridiculous, right? And I think that this is the big factor. This is one big factor, and the reason why I'm saying that is that the game industry or game media or something like that has just glossed over that sale. Well, they said they just divested, right? Yeah, but divested at what price, right? And why so quickly, right? And why to Embracer, right? Why haven't you waited for I don't know, for a few more months and then sell the studio to another suitor for double the price or whatever it could have been, right? And I think that this factor is the main factor why the CEO was booted out, right? So Square Enix has a new CEO since spring this year, right? And I think that the single big factor, single reason why that happened was that sale to Embracer. But now that is history, right? Now the company is looking at the Final Fantasy 16 launch, which is around the corner at the time of recording. Final Fantasy 14 is their golden goose, their forever game. Not many people are talking about it, but they have been making, sorry for the casual language, but making bank with that game forever now, right? I mean, it's just an unbelievable success story. At some point in time, a couple of months ago, they stopped accepting new users into the game because they said, guys, we cannot handle the traffic anymore. Right? Imagine that, right? Imagine Epic doing that, right? I mean, they said, we cannot uphold the service quality when we let new users in. It's too much, right? So, I think that Final Fantasy 14, if we have this podcast recording in 10 years, it's still going to be around, right? So, and it's still going to make money for Square Enix. It's just such a well-made live service game, and very rare for a Japanese company, right, to have a live service game on console or on a bigger platform for a traditional video game company. But Square Enix has made that happen, and I would say that. Another big point about Square Enix is their blockchain game business. So it's the biggest company in Japan in the gaming sector that is looking at the blockchain game space. And even though the CEO changed, they still seem to focus on Web3 gaming a lot. If you look at the latest earnings report, the English version, 1/3 of the latest earnings report was focused on Web3. Right, so they focus still a lot on crypto, metaverse, investments, partnerships, and things of that nature in that particular space. So that I think that differentiates them from not the fact that they do it, but the level of intensity with which they are focusing on that space differentiates them from many other Japanese video game companies.
Are you excited for Final Fantasy 16? I am. I'm excited for it.
Yeah, me too. I don't think they can top the last Zelda game, but a new demo just dropped. I played the demo a little bit because I was busy playing Tears of the Kingdom, but apparently that demo is super high quality, so people are very excited about it. It looks like.
Yeah, and just one other point I'd make. I want to go back to Crystal Dynamics. There was a huge push by Square Enix with Crystal Dynamics into IP game, licensed IP games. They did Marvel's Avengers. This is all speculation. You wonder if the failure of that game, played into the role of just dumping the business. Like that was their last shot at kind of making that work for them. It's because it never really was a fit with Square Enix, anyways. It was always like the weird bastard child, for lack of a better word. So yeah, just weird things going on.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with all of that. I'm just saying that the speed with which they sold it, right? I mean, why do you have to do a fire sale after all of these years? You're a profitable company. You sit on a ton of cash, right? I mean, you have big games coming out, right? I mean, you're safe, you're secure. Why are you selling it for $300 million in so surprisingly, so quickly to another company? Right, so I think they could have waited. I guess that's that's my main point. They could have waited, right? And Crystal Dynamics is sitting and ADOS/ADOS for back in the day. They are sitting they're sitting on the Tomb Raider franchise, right? And the first thing that Embracer did, of course, was to sell the Tomb Raider IP to Amazon. Why didn't Square Enix do that? Right, so that's I think that's what a lot of shareholders or a lot of people like myself or us have been asking themselves. And once again, I think that's probably, I can just speculate. Obviously, I'm not working for Square Enix. I cannot talk for them. That's probably the main reason why Kiryu-san is the new CEO now.
Maybe they can buy it back cheaper in a few months.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Might be able to buy all of Embracer at some
That,
point.
yeah, that's a window of opportunity for the new CEO to pay them back. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, moving on to another company that has a lot of cash and could also theoretically afford Embracer at some point. Nexon. For those that don't know, Nexon is an interesting corporate structure. If you're into like financial engineering, it's a Korean-based, Japanese-listed game company with global studio operations and an American CEO. So if you want to put the Hangover Savant gambling meme in front of me, that's basically what you have to do to think about how this company is structured a little bit. It has a market capitalization of about $18 billion, so it's much larger in the market than Square Enix. And in 2022, they generated $2.7 billion of revenue, so actually only comparable revenue, a lot more operating income, $800 million. For 2023, they're projected to generate $3 billion of sales and $1 billion of OI, so that's 10% and 27% growth. Their biggest titles, MapleStory and Dungeon and Fighter. In the West, we probably don't hear a lot about those, but Serkan, I saw in the notes you put the actual number of lifetime revenue, so I won't jump the gun, but Dungeon and Fighter is one of the most successful, not just video game franchises, but entertainment franchises ever created by revenue. MapleStory is one of the most successful in Korea. The bulk of the company's revenue does come from Korea and China. And just looking ahead, they're taking a lot of shots on goal in the next 18 months. I think they have 8 large games, 8 new titles planned, including one from Embark. It's called Finals. And if you don't know Embark, that's the studio that was formed by Pat Soderlund, who was the COO at EA for a while. And then Nexon invested in that, and then they bought them out. So a lot of moving pieces. One of the biggest PC online games in China is DNF. Tons of MMORPGs like MapleStory in Korea. Aggressive growth plan. What are your thoughts on Nexon?
Yeah, so I think that Nexon is like a juggernaut, right? I mean, just a real powerhouse that almost nobody knows, especially in the West. Of course, in Asia it's much better, but in the West, nobody really talks about Nexon all that much, right? And you mentioned $18 billion market cap. It's in the neighborhood of Take-Two, right? So in the U.S., it's not higher than Take-Two, but it's roughly in the same ballpark, right? As you said, like it's a Korean company that's listed in Japan for various reasons. But one reason, of course, being that Japan is the bigger market for them. They had a bigger market opportunity here, so that's why they moved the HQ to Tokyo and then got listed in Japan. And they have an American CEO, believe it or not. Right, so it's a very special, special company from that whole setup point of view. And I would say that one big bullet point about them is they sit on a huge pile of cash. They do not seem what to do with it. So in 2021, they made the headlines globally when they put 100 million in Bitcoin on the balance sheet, and that was just 2% of the cash pile back then, right? And it's just a very cash rich, very well operated like a machine that has been running for the last couple of years, especially riding on China game revenue from a game called Dungeon Fighter. I think that Matthew just mentioned that. I think it's called Dungeon and Fighter in Korea, and these guys have been basically milking the that Chinese audience for years and years and years now, for 2 decades now, you can say. And I think that what is interesting about Nexon is that their revenue split is still 60-40 in favor of PC. So they've been trying for a long time now to transform themselves into a mobile gaming business, because as probably everybody here on the listening to this podcast knows, is that mobile is like about half of the gaming market, right? Overall, globally speaking, right? So. And still 40% of revenue is still from China. Only a quarter is coming from Korea, so it's still very China heavy. And at the moment, there's like two big things I would say that stand out for Nexon. One is that they have identified, as you just said, the console business as the next frontier. So because of course, investors are always looking for the next growth story, and Nexon has identified after Bitcoin. They identified the console business as the next growth opportunity, right? So they're doing like a few console games now, live service games, and I just hope that they're going to do better than Krafton with Callisto Protocol, right? So because Krafton did the same thing, they branched out into console. It didn't really work for them that well. And the other big bullet point about Nexon is their Web3 gaming aspirations. So just like a lot of other Korean companies, they are actively developing blockchain-based games. They're doing two MapleStory-based games and metaverses. And MapleStory is like a long-standing RPG franchise, casual RPG franchise for Nexon. So they're turning that franchise into like a Web3 property. I think into two different Web3 properties actually. And a final big point I would say about Nexon is their upcoming launch of Dungeon Fighter on mobile in the Chinese market. So a lot of investors have been waiting since 2020 at least for Nexon to be able to launch that game in China. But as everybody knows, launching games in China is very difficult, especially if you're a foreign studio. So that's still a big question mark for investors around the launch of that particular game.
Yeah, you talked about a unicorn in one of your previous responses. Mobile DNF is another one of those unicorns. It's just,
yes.
It's always been talked about. It always seems like it's around the corner, and then something happens. I think at one point they killed the game and they restarted it, right? And then they had the gaming freeze in China, the license freeze, and now it's kind of in limbo. I think everyone agrees that when this comes out, it's going to be a gangbusters release. It's just like, is it this year? Is it next year? Is it 5 years? No one really has a clue. A lot of that is, as you mentioned, geopolitics, but it is just kind of like just how successful DNF has been on PC. It's just assumed that this is going to be an absolute, money grab on mobile when it releases in China. And then it has released in Korea on mobile, and it's done fairly well, like relative to the Korean market. So I think it's encouraging for what they're trying to do in China. It's just like, it's just a matter of when they can hit those 700 million people with this game.
Yeah, I tested the game. It's actually well made. Pretty good. Mobile version of the PC client. But yeah, of course, the big obstacle is the Chinese license, because the government doesn't care. The government over there doesn't care if anybody is waiting for a license for that game, even though Tencent is their partner in China, right? I mean, that's another factor, but it apparently doesn't help.
Got it. Any other thoughts on Nexon, or should we move on to NCSoft?
I think we're good. I mean, you also pointed it out. It's just like, and it's not unique to Nexon. It's not unique to Square Enix. It's just kind of, when you compare balance sheets of companies in Japan to pretty much Western companies anywhere else in the world, they just hold a lot of cash. And I think it's just quasi-cultural, conservative management. But you mentioned it, and it's just worth pointing out for all of these companies. They sit on a lot of cash, and it's always a question of what are they going to do with it, and they just never do anything with it except buy $100 million of Bitcoin.
All right, well, NCSoft. So roughly $4.9 billion in terms of market cap, but that's down from a high of over 19 billion in February 2001, so down almost 75% from that high. Since that February 21 high, NCSoft has been on a fairly steep decline. The stock went down to about 4.7 billion back in September of last year before popping back up to 7.8 and then coming back down to its current level of about 4.9 billion. In terms of the products, the company generates most of its sales on mobile, so about 78% of its revenue as of Q1 of 23, with the primary games including Lineage W, Lineage 2M, Lineage M, and Blade and Soul 2. And then on the PC side, the biggest games by revenue include Lineage, Lineage 2, Guild Wars 2, Aeon, and Blade and Soul. So NCSoft really is kind of like an ARPG MMO company with a big focus on mobile. And I think in terms of products or future upcoming products, one really big open question is Project TL, also known as Throne and Liberty. It's a big MMO project that was, I believe, first announced in 2011 as Lineage Eternal, but has just been suffering many delays since then. And even further, there's been a lot of negative feedback in terms of the game's too simple in terms of the combat system. There's too much autoplay. And a lot of people are saying this is just a mobile game on PC. And so, based upon that, as well as potentially a friendlier monetization approach, which could be good or bad, I think that's the current state of NCSoft. So I'll turn it over to the real expert, Serkan. It'd be great to get your take. Have I characterized NCSoft appropriately, and what would you add to how I've currently described NCSoft?
Yeah, so I wouldn't call myself a quote unquote expert on the Korean, particularly on the Korean game companies. But I've been looking for at these all of these Korean game companies because of the geographical distance to Japan, which is a lot shorter than to the west. Or for example, not also because all of these companies that we talk about from Korea are very active in the Japanese market. Right, that NCSoft is also very active in Japan with their own offices, their own teams, and all of that jazz. And I think that apart from hardcore Asian MMORPG fans in the West, there are some, but there are not a lot. And of course, industry people like ourselves, not many people know about NCSoft in the West, right? So unlike Krafton, right, which operates PUBG or Paralybis, Paralybis from Korea has a Black Desert, which has an okay audience in the West, or EVE Online, right? I mean, they own EVE Online. But I guess that the one reason why we talk about these Korean companies is that's one reason why we talk about these Korean companies, because there's not a lot of information flowing outside outside the Asian region on these companies, right? And I think that what is interesting about this company in particular is that they were focusing entirely on the PC up until 2016. So they had all of these brands, that you mentioned, especially Lineage, which is the bread and butter product. And then from 2017, NCSoft, unlike Nexon, has actually been successful in transforming itself into a mobile studio, right? So they launched 3 Lineage games on mobile since then. At the first one, Lineage M, that they launched on mobile, I think it was in 2017 or something like that. Yeah, but when they started transforming themselves into again more of a mobile game studio, that was even a big hit in Japan for years. Even though MMORPGs and the PC in general are not really big in the Japanese market, right? So back then, Netmarble published that game in the Japanese market actually, believe it or not, for NCSoft. And today, a lot of the major bulk of NCSoft revenue is coming from mobile, right? And but I think that one big challenge for them is that the big geographical concentration of their revenue and of their how can I say, of their popularity of the games is in Asia, right? 40% of
Right.
their revenue is coming from Korea, or another big chunk is coming from other regions in Asia, like China, for example. Right, and you mentioned the stock price. The stock price. I mean, it's at, I think it's I checked yesterday. It was at 300,000 won, and it was 1 million won in 2021. And I think that
Okay.
one big reason was the pandemic-driven revenue boost. These Korean companies have enjoyed around that time. But still, it's a pretty rough drop from the highs back then, because the revenue didn't drop as much as the market cap did, right? So it seems to be like a mini bubble that a lot of the Korean companies we're seeing around 2021, late 2022. Krafton is another example, right? And Krafton is like not apples to apples comparison, because they IPO'd, right? But they IPO'd at, I think, 500,000 won, and they are 200,000 won now. So all of these Korean game companies, they're still multi-billion-dollar corporations, right? I mean, if Matthew just mentioned Nexon being an $18 billion company, but it's not as high as it used to be about 1.5 years ago for NCSoft either.
Got it. And I had a question on them, and you meant I found it ironic, first off, that when they first thought about mobile, their first thing they did was license their IP to Netmarble, and Netmarble made Lineage Revolution, Lineage 2 Revolution, and then they were like, hey, we can actually do that. So that's just a funny little history anecdote. But everything they've tried, mobile, Lineage W was supposed to do this, the most recent mobile game, it's supposed to be unlock the West for them. They haven't been able to do that. I mean, that was a big part of the strategy. Do you think that this is something that a company like NCSoft can do? Or do you think that the types of games they make, the genres they make, the type of art styles just aren't going to succeed in the West?
I think it's going to be tough for them in the West. Yeah, I think that it's because they don't only have to change the platform, which they already did, but they also have to change like the whole like identity of the company, right? I mean, the whole like studio structure, or like the whole like philosophy around the company, right? So for them, and even for Nexon, right, at least with their PC and the mobile games, they're trying, right? Nexon is trying too, with addressing like a bigger market outside the Asian markets. But it's I think it's a big challenge for NCSoft in particular. I think not with Lineage, and not with properties like Blade, like Blade and Soul, for example. I think it's going to be tough.
Yeah, it's always kind of been something that they all talk about doing, and they just kind of beat their head and do the same thing, and it doesn't work. But maybe it's just pandering to investors that, hey, we're growing, we have this opportunity. Maybe that's part of the game. But yeah, no, it's definitely an interesting company. They've also been doing this for a long time. Back to the PC days, right? And I think in the West we don't realize how successful and how long of success these companies have had, like NCSoft, in doing this.
But do you guys think when it comes to like ARPG MMO, is it a company thing, or do you think this is just like an inherent, it's like mobile MOBAs in the West just don't work well, but in China they're extremely great. And do you think like ARPG MMO, and it's just like a thing that Koreans like and just can't be translated well to Western markets, or do you think this like some Korean company can figure this out, or Chinese company or Japanese company for that matter?
I mean, if we think of Asian-based companies that are successful in the West, it's generally the ones that have been around the business for 30, 40 plus years, right? And it's IP that's been around for equally as long or partially as long, and like they have a better understanding of what the US customer wants and needs. It's a very hard market to punch into for several reasons. It's not just about, I mean, I think art style certainly has something to do with it, like development expertise and everything else, but it's like you've been doing business here for 30 or 40 years, you're going to have an edge on someone that's just doesn't. And that's kind of stood the test of time. Nintendo has 40-50% of their revenues in the US for a reason. Sony way more than that. And it's just like they have a sales motion, they have relationships with publishers, they have relationships with the distributors, and they just make good games. It's very hard to punch into.
All right, well, let's move on to our last company, which is Netmarble. This is a company that I don't think Wall Street guys like very much. Was similar to NCSoft, highly valued, or many of the gaming companies, right? Highly valued at 15 billion back in December of 2017. Since then, the company hit a COVID high of about 12.6 billion in market cap in September of 2020. Basically, massive COVID upswing. It went from 6.1 billion in May to 12.6 billion in September. And so similar to NCSoft, it kind of has been on this steep decline and uh, bottomed at about 2.5 billion in market valuation as of October of last year before popping back up to about 4.7, 4.8 billion earlier this year in April, before coming back down to about 3.5 billion today. So quick product highlights, then I'll turn it over to Serkan. On a product basis, I think Netmarble is best known in the West as the owner of companies that we're more familiar with, companies like Jam City and Kabam. And the company is largely mobile across a number of both IP and original IP games. On the IP side, they are probably best known for BTS World, Nino Kuni Crossworlds, Lineage Revolutions, as we had talked about previously, Marvel Future Fight, Seven Knights, and Fate Grand Order. And in some cases, like Fate Grand Order, which is that Sony Aniplex game that we had talked about, they are just doing localization and geo-servicing for Korea. Finally, Netmarble seems like it increasingly has plans for PC and console. On the PC side, they have 4 games live, and console 1 game called Seven Knights. But I believe that they have announced, or they've got more console game projects that are being planned. So with that, let me hand it over to Serkan. What do you think? Would you add anything in terms of characterization of Netmarble, and why do all the Wall Street guys hate this company?
Yeah. So I think that one interesting point about Netmarble is that they're a lot more internationalized than most of its other local competitors in Korea. So in Japan, for example, Netmarble was the first Korean company that actually made a huge splash in the market and did gigantic UA campaigns. So they launched the previous, what we just talked about with Lineage, when they launched the first Lineage game on mobile in Japan. I think they were the first company, even before Japanese companies, local companies did what they did. They launched a company, a game, Lineage, back then. In the Japanese market with a TV advertising campaign before the game was available for download, right? So that was part of their like pre-registration campaign. Just as a side note, right? So they came into the Japanese market with a bang, right? With a big blockbuster game and with a big blockbuster advertising campaign. With something they did something that no other local competitor did, and. So today, the interesting thing is that around 50% of their revenue is coming from North America, right? So of course, they bought Jam City, they have Kabam, and all of these things, but they seem to be a lot more focused on internationalization than NCSoft, for example. And I think that unlike NCSoft or Nexon, what is interesting about Netmarble is that they have a whole suite of smaller hits that they focus their not focus, but that they've been able to spread their revenue across. And so they're not really that dependent on 1 or 2 or 3 big IPs, but rather like a whole a bunch of smaller IPs that they self-developed, or mostly actually in the case of Netmarble, bought externally. And I think what is also interesting about Netmarble is that they have a huge focus on Web3 gaming, right? And what they did is they are developing games for Sandbox, which is like a metaverse. They partnered with Binance. They partnered with Kakao for Web3 gaming. And they have a subsidiary called Metaverse World, very low key, right? I mean, they're not using the Netmarble brand name for that, and that subsidiary has its own token, own NFT marketplace, own game platform. So that subsidiary already launched some blockchain games. One of them is called Meta Football, and Meta Football has not bad 10 million downloads on Android alone. It's a Web3 game, and it's like a futsal game, like an indoor soccer game. And they have other Web3 projects in the works. So they are very, very focused on the blockchain gaming business, and that seems to be one reason, together with the crypto winter that we're currently in, why investor sentiment has cooled off with regards to this company, because they have been very, very vocal in terms of support of the Web3 gaming space.
I think also one of the reasons investors have soured on it is, similar to like Embracer, a little bit like Zynga, this was an M&A roll-up story. You alluded to it, right? They've been very acquisitive since they went public in 2017, I believe. They basically top-ticked the social casino market in 2021. They bought SpinX, which I had never heard of until I pulled up the numbers at the time, and I was like, oh, these guys are actually big in revenue. So they pretty much they've kind of top-ticked everything in recent acquisitions, which isn't very good. And so there's obviously, they have great IP, and I don't think it's like Zynga where people question their ability to grow organically, but it's clear that we had the COVID bubble and valuations, plus they were being very acquisitive in that period. Now they're digesting those acquisitions that are not performing as well. The core games have come down because the COVID boost has come down. You have questions over the Web3 strategy, kind of all these things. And, diversification is good, but on the same token, it's like you're just it's kind of like a pile of lots of okay, good games, and there's no big, we talked about Nexon and how DNF prints money. Like they don't have a game, not at that scale, but they don't have a game at the scale that, this is printing money. This is the cash grab. This is what's driving the revenue and the profitability. And then everything else is nice to have. They don't have that marquee tentpole franchise to sit in front of all of these good, but not amazingly fantastic, super large games.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Otherwise, I think maybe we could also just, since we have Serkan, maybe we could even get thoughts on other players in Japan or Korea. So maybe we could shift there, Serkan. So if you have any like high level key thoughts or takeaways as far as any of the kind of like the rest of the players, like who should we know about, and are there any interesting trends or things we should be watching out for?
Yeah, so I think in the Japanese gaming space, I think Capcom is an interesting story, right? How they've been absolutely killing it over the last couple of years. I mean, it's not even funny anymore, right? So these guys, I mean, I have nothing to do with them. I never talk with any of the executives there or something. I cannot consult with publicly traded companies anyway, but I just admire them from an execution point of view. Right. I mean, the way that they have been, revitalizing old IP and driving up sales to unknown highs for the company, and in tandem with that, the market cap has risen. Investors are super happy, at least the early investors, right? And it's not a coincidence. Just a little bit like with Sony, right? And I think that what is interesting about this particular company is that they, believe it or not, discovered the PC as a gaming platform early on for a Japanese company, right? Because Japanese companies have this tendency to think in a very insular way. They think that news or like trends are not real until news are translated into Japanese, or trends actually reach Japanese shores. They think that this is some foreign thing that doesn't affect them, right? But Capcom is I would say the first big Japanese company that went big on Steam, right? And that did this multi-platform approach that everybody now is talking about in the global video game industry in the Japanese market. I think that the cracking PC first was one big reason why Capcom has been so successful in recent years. And what they also did in a very clever way is internationalizing the company from within. Right, and a lot of the times, I think Matthew just mentioned that, hinted at that earlier, it's just lip service from these Asian companies. We want to go west, we want to globalize. Everybody says that. Mobile game companies, when they came about in Japan 10 years ago, I was there. I can speak about it. They all said that, but they had no like structure inside, no real will to actually internationalize. It's different with Capcom. So if you look at Capcom, they have all of these franchises, right? So these hit franchises. And the latest Devil May Cry game, for example, Devil May Cry 5, one of the lead producers was an American, right? His name is Matt Walker. They hired like a real American as a top producer for that game. And for Resident Evil 8, the bigger franchise, right? For Capcom, one of the producers was an ex Bloomberg. Not ex Bloomberg. So there was an ex Bloomberg. That's a current Bloomberg editor that used to work for Capcom, but he's out. So in that case, the international not out, but he doesn't work for Capcom anymore. So in that case, the internationalization didn't work. But one of the Resident Evil 8 producers was an American. He works for Bungie now, This is all public information, of course, right? And he was a top producer on one of the top games for the entire company, right? And he actually appears inside the game, right? Just as a minor spoiler, right? And show me another, Japanese company that does that, right? I mean, they have maybe one of the other designer or like a programmer or like a software engineer in the background, but not at these top roles. But Capcom actually took that risk and really wanted to internationalize again itself from within, and that's also one reason why Monster Hunter World is now a breakout hit in the West too. It was like a big franchise only in Japan. People said a little bit like with the NC Soft and the NC Soft discussion that we just had, right? People said that it will never be successful in the West. It's too Japanese. But then, it became Monster Hunter World in particular in 2018. I think it was launched, became Capcom's biggest selling game of all time. Right, I think they sold 18 million or 19 million units of that game, right? So I think that Capcom is a very, very interesting case study for a big Japanese video game company that can actually go from one level to an entirely new level because of the efforts that were triggered from within the company.
And now we'll see if they can do it on mobile, right? Because now they're talking about Monster Hunter Mobile. I think that's like, if they can make mobile.
Yeah, I don't think that's, and it's interesting, right? But because what the communications from the company, right? I mean, this is just my opinion. I think it's not going to work because all of these Niantic properties after Pokemon Go didn't work. But the company itself said, look, that's not what I'm saying, but the company said like, we're looking at this primarily from a branding exercise. As a branding exercise, we want to make the Monster Hunter World IP more known outside Japan, right? And if you start communicating like that, in my book at least, that's a view, that's a big hint that they're not really believing in the commercial potential of that particular mobile game.
Yeah, I saw it announced, and I'm like, this is Witcher Monster Hunter, and that went nowhere either. It's like the same game, so it's like, I'm not super optimistic, but if they can make their IP work on mobile, then it's good for them and it's more upside. But they've already got a really strong business on PC already, which I think was already really impressive. You mentioned Monster Hunter World. I remember seeing that at E3 one year, and I was like, what's this like poor man's, Warcrafty type game? And then sold 10 million units out of the gate. And I was like, wow, okay, this is something. This is not like just, a little poor man's game. This is real. And it was quite impressive how they've been able to make that transition.
I remember 2018. I remember that trade specifically. I think Capcom tripled that year, and they ended up doing like 20, 30 million units. Just an absolute breakout hit, and the pushback against not being able to break into the West was just completely torn apart. Serkan, got another one for you. Thoughts on SEGA Rovio, so a Japanese company purchasing a Helsinki-based mobile gaming development studio. What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think that Joseph is more of an insider than I am. As an ex-Sega employee, I'm not an insider at all. So I cannot work or even consult to a publicly traded company. But I was puzzled. I was puzzled by the acquisition, and I tweeted about it. Usually I try to be a little bit silent on publicly on these deals, but in this case I couldn't. Right, so I was like, it really came out of nowhere. Right, So they snubbed Playtika, right? I'm not a big fan of Playtika, so I think that was the right move. This is just my personal opinion. Better to sell yourself to a Japanese conglomerate than to a company like Playtika. I mean, no offense to Playtika. I think that they built a huge business, a scale business, and but I think it's a probably better choice for Rovio. I'm not really sure how they're going to integrate. I know that Sega has already has bought like foreign companies in the West and has to some extent successfully integrated them into their own ecosystem. I believe in the gaming leadership of Sega. Utsumi-san, the new not the CEO of Sega proper, but the leader of the gaming unit. He is ex PlayStation OG, and he used to work at other game companies. He speaks English. He's very internationally minded. It's not so from that perspective. I was not thinking about that from that perspective. I was not that overwhelmed by the decision, but still, it seems odd. It still seems odd. I'm not really sure where the synergies are there. People are talking about bringing Sega to mobile. Sorry, Sonic to mobile and other properties from Sega to mobile. And Rovio, I mean, I'm not really sure. I mean, if that's how that is going to work, how successful that is going to be. But no, people in the Finnish gaming industry, they tweeted to me, they emailed me and said, "Oh my, hey, it's a profitable company. What are you talking about? Right? It's not as bad as people think, right? But still a little bit of a puzzle for me. I'm not sure what you guys think, but
I think we talked about it a little bit. I'm a little bit neutral personally, but
I think it just it fit the mold of the acquisitions that were happening at the time, in that they were all strategic and not necessarily ones you want to pick apart on fundamentals and price. It was good to see mobile M&A coming back to a degree. And I think if you look at Sega's vision for what it could be, I think all that makes a ton of sense. It's just, it's a ton of execution risk for a billion different reasons: cultural, spatial, time differences, discipline of certain studios, the success history of Rovio launching new hits and things like that. Sega not really being on mobile. I mean, there's a lot of things that you could pick apart in that thing, but I guess we kind of just got to leave it up to the test of time.
It's a great deal for Rovio. I mean,
absolutely.
They kind of had nowhere to go, and they were taking bids right and left, both solicited and unsolicited, and getting a deal. Even I actually didn't go back and double check, even though I said I would. I believe it was a discount to whatever the highest offer from Playtika was, but they were able to get a deal where they don't all get fired. So
right,
that's it's a good win for Rovio. I agree on Sega. It's a little mixed. I talked about Roblox and what they've done there with Sonic. I think Angry Birds to Roblox is an easy layup for them to make some incremental revenue from this deal. So I think there are some optionalities that they can pull, but we've seen lots of Asian companies. We talked about it for the last hour and a half. Fail to internationalize, westernize in particular, and that's the big strategic thesis here: is take Sega's mobile games that are relatively successful domestically and internationalize them, and we'll see if it works. But go Roblox.
Angry Birds pachinko machines.
Yeah, to your last point, Matthew, and I think to the point that you raised, Serkan, about Capcom getting like a US lead, that makes me think a little bit about the strategic question about how do we have, whether it's Korean company like NC Soft that's kind of ARPG MMO focused, but not really, it's not really growing or adapting to the Western market. And if we were to think about other examples, like for example, Krafton, who brought in Brendan Green, who had worked on, H1Z1 King of the Kill, and he kind of knew the battle royale space. They brought him on, and while I heard that development process was very problematic, but they eventually got a hit game using that model. And I know that there are companies like some Chinese companies that have brought on U.S. leads. I think Merge Mansion is another example of that, where maybe this model of bringing somebody Western who has more of the Western sensibilities to work with as a lead, like a Korean or a Japanese game development studio, maybe that would be more interesting for some of these companies to try just to get greater adoption in the West. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Serkan.
Yeah. Thank you for reminding me, because you talked about trends in Asia, and I think one big trend in Japan is the quote unquote invasion of the big Chinese players in the Japanese gaming space, right? And they do what you said exactly, right? So they are hiring away top talent from Japanese game companies, people thought they never leave. Right, so Nagoshi-san from Sega is probably the biggest one. He's working for NetEase now,
Yakuza,
right? And NetEase, and of Yakuza fame, right? So that guy is now working on obviously not a Yakuza game anymore, but on a new IP bankrolled by NetEase, right? So and he brought his entire team, right? So they have a group official NetEase, like a corporate group photo of their team up on the website, right? And that's only one example. There are other examples, right? I mean, NetEase just opened its second video game studio, not mobile game, but video game studio in Japan. And that seems to be a trend, right? So to hire like local experts to win, not in the case of Chinese companies hiring Japanese talent, not only winning in Japan but also globally, right? Because Nagoshi-san's Yakuza series, it's not a mega blockbuster in the West, but it's doing fairly okay, right, in the US and in Europe, and I think it has also helped Sega as a brand overall in these regions. But that's a big one, right? How the proud Japanese mobile game, but also video game makers are now being not endangered, but now you have these Chinese companies like NetEase and like Tencent. Bilibili is also in Japan with its own team. They're doing mobile games and things of that nature. And how these Chinese companies have identified Japan as one of the big frontiers apart from the West in terms of growth. And again, one big way how they do that is hire local talent.
Very
All
interesting.
right. Serkan, thank you so much for joining us. I think that's basically it, unless anyone's got any last minute remarks. If for anyone interested in you, Serkan, I know you're famous on Twitter, but what's the best way to discover more about you or to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I think apart from Twitter, where I'm sometimes too snarky and then I regret it, but I'm trying to behave on Twitter. But apart from Twitter, serkantoto.com is maybe like a good address if you want to read a little bit about like the mobile game industry in particular in Japan. I sometimes cover the video game industry as well on that side, but I think these two avenues probably.
Okay, great. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. And for our audience, we will catch you next time. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Serkan. That was fun. Nice to meet
Thank
you.
you.